Continuing on talking about parsing JSON. We love parsing JSON. That's the heart of iOS development, really. You have some API, you present it in a collection view, table view, whatever sort of collection or UI. Today, we'll continue talking about parsing JSON using URLSession. Not a wrapper, not Alamo Fire, not network helper, but basic URLSession. So that's the goal of our day, to review how to parse JSON using URLSession, right? So we're gonna parse JSON from a web API. Over here, I left some web APIs in the lesson. There's more web APIs. I will also link to the GitHub repo, which has a lot of APIs, whether it be authentication required or open access. The APIs I have here are all open. They don't require any sort of like authentication key or OAuth. It's basically you take this endpoint and you put it into your project or Postman and you get back data. Here we have the Apple Search API, we have the City Bike API, we have the Random User API, Open Trivia, and here we have COVID-19 API. This is actually updated daily with like data on COVID cases, recoveries, and such. So again, if you guys are still looking for solo projects, this API gives you a lot of data and it's open. No authentication key, nothing required, and I think it's updated daily. So you can take a look at that one as well. The API we'll be using today is the City Bike API that gives us information about stations, where they're located, what their lat and longs are, what the capacity of bikes are, like is it 55 bikes in the rack and stuff like that. And I left to do at the bottom of the lesson. So at the very bottom of the lesson here, again, we have to find ourselves just continuing coding. If you don't continue coding, there's certain things you're just gonna forget along the way. So here I left some extra items for us to do, whether it be review next week or as we're working on projects to put on our GitHub, there's some extra items here. For example, at the end of our lesson, we'll have a table view, but you could refactor your table view to be a map view such that using the lat and long to present annotations on a map with a search bar, right? And here you could get real-time data. This endpoint here, again, open, no auth required, gives you real-time data of the bike availability at a station. So before you get to the station, you'll know, is there 12 bikes left? Is there 0 bikes left? Should I go to that station? Should I go to the next station? Also some sort of app idea if you guys want to work on that. Allow the user to search the map, refactor the API client here for folks looking towards the newer APIs in Apple. As far as like asynchronous programming goes, you could refactor our API client from using a closure to using combine. The next thing, you could add persistence to the app. Again, make the app your own at the end of this. And then you could actually section it out as well by whatever metric you want. So this is the app we'll be building. Our objectives, again, we'll keep writing unit tests to get us more familiar with writing tests against some JSON payload. And we'll be using URLSession to write our API client. And we'll be using the City Bike API. So at this point, let us actually copy the endpoint here, HTTPS all the way down to JSON. So copy that endpoint and we'll go to Postman shortly. Actually, let's go to Postman now. So copy the endpoint, again, City Bike, station information. And where is my, come here. Let's go to, so go to your Postman, it's a GET request. Just paste in the endpoint here and press send. At that point, we should get data. So right now, our Postman should get populated with data. What's the top level data structure here for our JSON?
A dictionary?
It's a dictionary, very good. It's a dictionary. The first key we encounter is a data field. And that data field, what data type is data?
Is it also a dictionary?
It's also a dictionary. So here we have a dictionary, and inside that dictionary, we have a stations key. What type of stations?
An array.
An array of dictionary.
an
Oh, an
array.
array, yeah. No,
Yeah, an
an
array
array
of dictionary of objects here, right? So we'll create
okay.
this object as a Swift object. This object here will be, we'll call it our station object. A station has a type, an ID, lat long, region ID, and already we're saying we probably want to use coding keys on this because it's snake case. So we probably want to use coding keys on this to make it more Swifty. So this is what our JSON looks like. So as before, we'll grab some JSON here. So from line number 1, let's grab 2 stations. So from line number 1, let's go ahead and copy down to line 45. So copy down to line 45. Again, we should all have the same number of lines here. Line 45, where do we go to validate our JSON?
JSON lint.
We're gonna go to JSON lint. Thank you. We'll go to jsonlint.com. We'll paste the JSON in. What are we missing? We're missing a square bracket and 2 curly brackets, correct? Yes?
Yeah.
Do we see that? So square bracket closes our array, and curly bracket closes our data, and curly bracket closes our entire JSON. So let's go ahead and do so. So make sure there's no commas here. We said square bracket followed by curly bracket followed by curly bracket. Curly bracket. I think I made an error here. This should be curly bracket and validate. So at this point, my JSON is validated. I'll go ahead and copy it. Copy to the clipboard. And let's go continue on. So next step in this process, we'll go create an Xcode project. Let's navigate to Xcode. Navigate to Xcode and create new project, single view application. And we'll call this one Parsing. We are parsing, but Parsing JSON URLSession. Let me make sure that name coincides with everything we've been using. Give me 1 second. Just want to keep it consistent. Parsing JSON. Parsing JSON using. Parsing JSON using URLSession. This is good. And go ahead and click next. Again, we're not adding unit tests. We'll add it after the fact. And create. Great. Let me make sure I change my font here. Presentation dark should be okay for now. And let's go ahead and create that unit test. So we'll navigate over to the test navigator. The test navigator. I clicked on it by clicking on the test navigator in my navigation area here. I'm clicking on the add button at the bottom. Click on the add button. Add new unit test target. Keep the default name they gave us. And click finish. And now I have a new target. It's a test target. I go to my navigation folder. Now I have a new folder here, which is my test suite. I click on my parsing JSON test here. And now I'm in my Xcode class. I will remove the boilerplate code. And I'll create a test model. We don't have a model yet. We'll come back to that. So test model, first thing we'll do is arrange. My arrange is going to be my JSON data multi-line string, followed by data, converting it to data using UTF-8 format. And here I'll paste my validated JSON here. So at this point, we have our JSON data. Next step, let's go create our model. So here we have our test model. We only have our JSON. We still need the model itself. So let's go create the model. I'll right click, I'll click new file. It's a Swift file. I click next. And for the name of my file, I will call it station. And I'll click. Make sure the target is your project target and not the test. Okay, so make sure target here is selected for your actual project, not the test. And go ahead and click create. And now we have our empty file. So we'll go ahead and start building our model. We'll call it station, conforms to be quotable. And what does our station look like? Where is my, anybody wants to help me build my model? What does station have? Anybody?
Station.
Oh, sorry.
Let's go ahead.
Station type?
Station, you said station type? Oh, station
Yeah.
type?
Yeah.
Station, it's camel case, right? Like this?
Yeah.
What's the data type of station type?
String?
String. What else we have on the station?
Latitude?
Latitude. Is it latitude or just lat?
It's lat.
And what type is it?
Double?
It's a double. Anybody else? Thank you, Chelsea. Somebody else? What else does our
It
station
might
have?
not be a double, by the way. It has, I can't remember if it's a double or a float.
Let's see. Lat here, this guy?
Yeah.
So it's a double, right? Double holds more floating point numbers than a float.
Okay.
Right. So review. Review. This is double. A double holds more floating point values than the float. Okay. Very good. Thank you, Chelsea. Anybody else? Let's build our station out. What else does our station have? We're not going to take everything, but what else?
Longitude.
Longitude. And is that longitude or long or something?
Long.
Long. Okay. Also double, yes?
Yeah.
All right. One more.
Capacity.
Capacity. Very good. We need that. What type is this?
Integer.
Integer. We can have 1.5 bytes, right? Very good. Somebody else? Thank you, Luba.
Name as a string.
Name would be good. That's very good. We need a name of a station. And I think we are good here for our station type. Thank you, Greg. Awesome. Is that the top level though? Is that the top level of our JSON?
No.
No. So Luba, thank you. Somebody else, what's the top level here? Help me build a top level model for our JSON. I'm looking, Jocelyn.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hello.
We're looking for the top level JSON here, representation. If I go back to the JSON here.
That'll be data.
That'll be data, very good. So we could probably call this like a results wrapper or something like that. Results wrapper also conforms to the quotable. And we said data. What type is data?
Stations.
Stations, okay. But data itself is stations, but stations itself has an array, right? So we need, it looks like we need an extra data model, correct? So we'll go ahead and we'll create an extract here. We'll just call the thing stations. Actually, it doesn't really matter here. It does. Stations wrapper, the name. And stations wrapper has stations, yes?
Stations, yep.
Stations. And stations, what's the data type of stations?
It's an array.
It's an array. Array of?
Station.
Station, very good. So now we're working backwards. We're going back to data. Data has a key called stations, correct?
Yes.
Well, not stations, but it would be
A
the station
station
wrapper.
wrapper.
Very good. And this is a dictionary, it's not an array. Thank you very much, Jocelyn.
Welcome.
Excellent. Any questions here? So if we look at our data, top level, we have data. Data is a dictionary or an object, and we represent it by the stations wrapper here. And inside of stations wrapper is an array of stations. So stations wrapper, inside of it is an array of stations. And that's what we have. Great. Okay, so we have our model. Let's go back to our test and continue on. So just remember we have our top level as results wrapper. So that's what we'll be decoding. So back in our test model, let's keep going. And let's write our do catch here. And we're getting back results. We'll try to decode it using JSON decoder. May, what are we decoding here? What's the object we're passing in here?
Data.
In here, this the first argument?
Sorry, it's called results wrapper.
Results wrapper. But why isn't our results coming up here?
You have to import the model.
We have to import the project, yes?
Yes.
Okay, so add testable, thank you, May. Add testable, import our project. Our project is parsing JSON using URLSession. So build, and we go back down, and now we should be able to get wrapper coming up, dot self, the constructor. So now we have results, and results dot data would get us, let's see, let's go back here. We have results. If we go dot data, we have the wrapper, dot stations, and we'll get our stations. And then we'll figure out what we want to test here. What's a good thing to test? Let's see. We could just do the capacity. Capacity is fine. Capacity, so we'll test capacity. So here, I'll say expected capacity is 55 bytes. Expected capacity is 55. Let's continue on. So here we'll say stations equal to results dot data dot stations. That gets us an array of stations. And here we'll do one more. We'll say first station equal to stations at array index 0. Great. And now let's go to our assert. Assert, we'll say XCT assert equal, our expected capacity should be equal to the first station dot capacity, which should be equal to 55. So 55 should be equal to 55. This is what we're testing here. If we have a decoding error, we'll fail and we'll print out what the decoding error is here. So decoding error is error. Great, so the act is here, the assert is here, and we should be good to go ahead and test. Let me change my simulator to Pro Max. And let me go ahead and run my test by Command U. I'll press Command U to run the test. Actually, let me stop this. We like to make our test fail first. So I'll put 54 here. I'll run Command U again. And here it clearly says 54 is not equal to 55 because this here, the first station is 55. So we know that test works. Just make it pass now. And now our test passes. 55 equal to 55. Does everybody get the test to work?
Yep.
Yes?
Yep.
All right, very good.
Yep.
There's one more thing we need to do before we leave our model. What is that? Do we submit that code to an employer?
No,
Why?
because the names are not Swifty.
Very good. So now we need to go ahead and use coding keys to change those names to more Swifty types. For example, station type. We change that to camel case station type, like that. And you could go ahead and change the whole name completely if you want. Like you could make latitude if you want, and stuff like that. But for now, we'll just change station type. Is there anything else we need in that JSON? No, we're good for now. Region ID, if you're doing the extra credit stuff later, you could grab region ID and you could use the region ID to make sections. But for now, this is all we're gonna use. So let's go ahead and implement our coding keys here. So coding keys, we have string and we have coding key. So the name stays the same. We'll change the station type. The original name, we always have to keep that. So station, make sure you write it the same way. Right? We'll keep lat. Again, we could change lat very easily to latitude. Let's just do that actually for testing. And longitude was on, and opacity will keep the same. And now, since we've done this, we'll get an error now because Swift does not know about station underscore type anymore. So now we have to change this to station type. We have to change lat to latitude. We have to change long to longitude. Like that. And at that point, we should be good to go. So it's good. You see the benefits of writing a unit test? Right now, we could just run Command U and make sure our model still works correctly, which it does. Our test succeeded here. So every time you change something and you have a test, you just run the test again, and you could validate that your data is still working correctly. It's still parsing the JSON correctly. Any questions? Okay, good. So we've done our test. Let's now go on to write our API client, the heart of this lesson here. So let's create a new file, Swift file, and we'll call it API client. And we'll make it a class, API client. What does API client have? Well, it has only one function for now, to fetch. We'll just call it fetch data. We'll keep this very generic right now. I have a reason for that, because you could change this to, I'll keep it to do here, convert to generic. Where you could take in
Sorry,
any.
can you go back to
The
the
test?
station really quickly?
Station. Okay. Are you okay?
Yeah.
Sorry, 1 second.
Yeah, I also have errors.
What's your error? What's your error?
Station type does not conform to decodable.
You're missing one of those you change here, and you probably do not change here.
Probably.
One
But
of the cases
you're going too fast, so it's hard to.
to keep up.
Uh-huh.
That's okay. I will send that out to you. I'll slow down a little bit here. Thank you for that.
Okay. Like when you make an error, then it's hard to find it because, you know.
Got it. I'll slow down a couple notches. Anybody else needs the station model?
I need to look at the test.
Okay, test.
Did you import the testable?
Yeah.
Oh, you did. Okay. Can you scroll down real quick? All the way down to the do catch.
One second, okay, I'll be right back. Give me 1 second, I'll be right back. 1 second.
Okay, babe. Sorry. Bye-bye.
Sorry, I had an emergency here. Is everybody here with me?
Yep.
Yeah.
One, are you good with what you're looking for with the unit test?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. At this point, we're all good with the model and the test, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, please feel free to jump in and let me know if my pace could be a bit slower. All right. So here we're back in the API client. And in the API client, we convert into, well, that was a to-do, convert to a generic API client such that this could take any type. Like this. And you would just have to conform API client to quote. Yeah, leave that here as a to-do for you to do. All right, let's continue on. So here we are. We have an API client. It's fetching data. Our data doesn't take in any input, or our function doesn't take in any input. For example, there's no search that the user is doing. But again, for your extra bonus items, you could definitely do search such that the user is searching for, searching your map for like a zip code or location. So that could easily take in like a keyword search or whatever it is. But for now, our fetch data doesn't take in any input, but it will capture a closure. So our closure here, actually we'll come back to the closure later. But for now, let's go into writing our API code. So first we'll have an endpoint, an endpoint URL. That endpoint URL is the one in Postman. So navigate over to your Postman and copy the URL that we have in Postman and paste it into the endpoint here. Great. So here we have our endpoint, and this is using URLSession. So we have our endpoint. We need a URL. So here we need a URL.
Can we make your screen
Bigger?
yeah, just a little, like the font?
Okay, I'll go bigger. Okay, cool. That's good.
Oh, that's, you can make it.
I think that's what I have. Other than that, I just have to tweak it down a little bit, but that's okay.
Okay,
That's fine.
That's very big, but that's perfect. Thank you.
All right, good. Fetch data, we have our endpoint. We need a URL to create our network request. This is the part, this is very, very important to know how to do this from scratch. An employer gives you a code challenge. You don't want to say import network helper or something here. You want to show them you could write native code, native networking code. So I'll go even slower here to make sure that we're all catching this. So first step, we need a URL to create our network request. I'll use the guard statement because our URL is optional. I'll use my URL initializer that takes in a string. The string I'm going to pass in is the endpoint. And here, if this URL is a bad URL, it's returning nil here. So this is not good. But here, what do we know so far from yesterday and the previous lessons is returning here simply is not enough. We need to let the person who's using our API to let them know something went wrong, right? Return here is not enough information to let them know something went wrong with that URL. So this is where we start writing an enum to capture the different cases of errors. All right, so here we'll create an enum and we'll call it API error.
Oh, okay.
Either one, doesn't, yeah. What was your name? What name are you gonna call it?
You usually say app error.
App error is fine, API error is fine, app error. App error, the first encounter of an error is a bad URL. So let's write that out. So case bad URL. It would be nice to capture the string to let the user know what the string looks like. So here we'll use an associated property, string, associated value string. So here, instead of just simply saying return, actually we need to write our completion to capture that. So right now, this fetch, let me make sure I write notes here because I've seen this too many times. The fetch data method does an asynchronous call. This means the method returns before the request is complete. This here is very, very important to know why, we can't simply say return some array here. I cannot just say return, what are we looking for? Stations.
Is
I can
complete,
just,
not incomplete.
where? Incomplete, is complete, right?
Yeah.
Thank you. So here I can simply say return. An employer asks you, or anybody asks you, hey, why can't I just simply return station here? Well, this is always going to be empty. You, in an asynchronous call, you're about to make a network call. This here is always going to be empty because your function returns. When I say the function returns, it returns whatever you have here before the actual request is done, because it's an asynchronous network call. Okay? Asynchronous, you have no idea as to when it's going to be complete. Okay? So this here needs to be captured. So here, when dealing with asynchronous calls, we use a closure. Okay? Other things you could use, other mechanisms include delegation, our favorite topic. You could also use notification center. Okay. And newer to us, newer to iOS developers, as of iOS 13, is combine. Okay. But here today we'll be using closure. So we'll be using a closure to capture the value when the network is done. And there's going to be a callback in our view controller saying, hey, here's your data. You could do whatever you want with it. So here in our fetch data function definition, we'll define a closure. We'll call it completion. You could call it anything you want. Here we'll call it completion. You could call it callback, right? You could call it anything you want. You could call it finished, right? But here we'll call it completion. A completion handler. It's add escaping, again, because the function returns before we get a value back. Our closure looks like this. It's a result type, captures a result type. Result type has two values. It could be the actual data you're looking for. In our case, we're looking for an array of stations. What's our second type here?
Error.
Error. In our case, we'll use our app error. Thank you. And we'll build, make sure our completion closure is correctly syntaxed, right? So this completion here, the purpose of it is to capture the value from our network call, okay? As I said, there's other ways about doing this. Delegation, notification center, combine, right? But here we're using a closure, okay? It's good to know one way really good before we start looking at other ways to do it. You add some challenge, you know the way that you've been using, you go with that. They ask you like, hey, can you do it using notification center? If you're not fluid, I'm not very familiar with it, that's okay. Do it the way that you know best. Everybody with me so far?
Yep.
Good. All right, so this is where we are. And now we could use our completion because we have access to it. And our completion captures values. Remember, closures captures values, right? It's a reference type. Okay, so here we are. We have our first sort of error. It's a bad URL. We'll capture this. So we'll say completion. There's two states. The beautiful thing about our result type, it has two states, a failure or an error, or success, sorry, failure or success. In our case here, this is a failure. So we'll say failure, go ahead and capture this bad URL. And the bad URL will pass in the actual URL here. That URL that the person put in, actually not URL, endpoint, because we don't have access to endpoint to URL inside of our return block here. So we'll pass in the endpoint that they put in. So that way they could take a look at it and see if there's an extra space. If there's an extra space somewhere, like if you have a space anywhere in your URL here, it's not gonna be valid. So they'll be able to take a look at it and see what went wrong. So this is our first actual case where we encounter an error. Any questions so far?
Yeah, I got a quick question. As far as the extra spaces go in the URL, is it okay? Like I know we've used encoding, or
Yeah, you
I
could.
forget what that is, but sometimes I just use like replace occurrences of with %20. Is that like acceptable, or should we always use the encoding?
I would use the encoding because that API was written specifically for that.
Okay.
Yep. That's if you pass in like if the person pass in like a query, like they're searching for Prospect Park, for example. Right, so Kelby's question was about making sure that you're not setting up a query where it has a space in there. And then the API for this is adding, what is it called? Adding % encoding here, where you pass in URL host allowed. You see that API was written specifically for this, so I would use it. Does that make sense?
Yep.
All right, very good. So here you'd use this, and then that would add our %20. Cool, good, great. Thank you for that question. So here we are. So we encountered our first sort of error. It's a bad URL. We have our URL here. If it's not a bad URL, we are good. So here, when we get to line 41, we have a good URL. So we could continue on. For the purposes of this, making a request is probably too much, but I'll still make a request here so we know what that looks like. Because most likely, you make a request if you package in more things in a request. Well, if you package in more information, you make a request. If you're just simply asking a URL for information, you could simply just pass the URL without making a request. What am I talking about? So actually, we'll see it later. But for now, let's actually make a request here, or create a request. Create a GET request. Other requests we have. What's the next example of a request?
Post.
Post, very good, thank you, sir. So we have post, we have delete, we have patch, we have put. So here, let's create our request. We'll make it immutable because I don't think we added anything extra to it, but you would make it mutable if you were to add, for example, a header or any other body type. So here we'll make it immutable, and it's a request. The type of it is a URL request, and URL request itself takes a URL. It needs a URL. So we'll go ahead and pass in our URL here.
Alex?
Yes.
I'm getting an error for the URL. It says non-void function should return a value.
Let's see, non-void. I think we made an example here. Are you still returning something in your function? I think I'd put like an arrow with an array. Yeah, so remove that. That was just for illustration purposes. You good?
Yeah.
All right, very good. Okay, so here we have our request. And again, this request could very easily be a var because maybe you want to put more things inside of your request. For example, you could say what type of body or what body content you have. Other things a request has, we have header fields, cache policy. There's a lot of things on a request you could do, right? The type of HTTP method. And again, there's no need to say this is a GET request because it's GET by default. Everybody with me?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So the URL request object itself has a lot of stuff there. So that's something you definitely want to keep on your radar as far as like knowing what else can I pass in with a request. So taking a look at the API, going to the documentation here, I would highly suggest as reading to know more about what we could do. Because we've used it many different ways in the course. We've used it to post, we've used it to pass content type. Like if you post in JSON, you would have to pass in, you'd have to add some value here. And for the value, whatever value in our case would say, it should be header field. What do you pass here? The header field, for example, would be like application content type. The value would be like JSON or application JSON. And the header field would be like content type. So those are the things we could do with a request. So request is very powerful. I showed it here for illustration purposes, but we really did not need an actual request here. We could just use the URL for the URL session. But this is very, very important to know what can I do with a request and what's the importance of it. The big importance of it is I could put in more values in it. Right, more values, more information. Now you package more things. Picture it as an envelope, right? You could put in one card, or you could put in many cards that you want to ship out to somebody or ask information from. So here we are. We have our request. Great. Next step in the whole process here is use URLSession to make the network request. Good old URLSession. This is what we're going to use at step 3. Well, we'll start off by saying let data task. And the reason why I'm doing this here, it's very important because we have to always, what do we have to do to our URLSession in order for it to actually go ahead and do the request?
Resume the data task.
Resume the data task. If we don't do that, it's never going to return any call. It's always in a suspended state unless we say resume, go ahead and do the work. So that's why I'm always using some sort of constant here. That way we don't forget to say data task.resume, because we don't forget warnings or we don't leave warnings in our code. If we don't use this particular constant, the Xcode will give us a warning. So that's a good way to say, hey, I'm forgetting something. So we'll see what that means more as we code along here. So URLSession dot shared. Here we're using the singleton on URLSession. This is enough unless you want to do extra configurations. Actually, let me put that notes in here. So URLSession dot shared is a singleton. This is sufficient to use for making post request.
Alex, why I don't see URLSession?
Foundation, maybe? You have import foundation, right?
Yeah.
Even that probably might work. Let me see. Actually, yeah, it's not gonna know anything because that's not playgrounds. So you have foundation here. Is there an error somewhere else in your code? Do a command B.
It could be that it's just not showing. If you type in just URLSession, there are other things that pop up behind it, but URLSession doesn't pop up on its own. Just put the dot and put shared. It should still work.
Okay, now it's working after building. Okay, thank you.
After building, okay, all right. Building gets us there. This is sufficient to use for making most requests. Using URLSession without the shared instance gives access to add in necessary configurations to your task. So for purposes of what we're doing here, URLSession.shared is enough. Unless you want to do your own sort of configuration on the URL session, for example, cache policies or whatever else you want to do, then you'd go ahead and just use URL session, create your own instance, and create your own initializer to set up the URL session. But the .shared instance here gives us enough of what we need. So on .shared, which is the instance of this class, I could go ahead and say data task. Now, data task, let's see what we have. We have data task with URL. As I said before, we did not have to use request here because we're not passing in any extra information to the request. Everybody got me for this one? This is very important. We could have totally used URL by itself, but I wanted to show us request and what can we do with request. Do I get a confirmation that everybody understands this?
Yep.
By extra information.
Okay.
Example, line 45, I could pass in what type of data I'm sending up if I'm making a post request. That's the extra information I'm talking about. Mr. Wan?
Is that used more for like when we post?
Yes, if you're posting and you want to send up some JSON data, you have to say content type, what type of data you're sending up. And if you're passing in the actual JSON body, you could actually pass in the JSON body through the request object. So I could say request.http body and pass in some data.
Okay, that makes sense. So are there any instances where we would use this for a get?
For a get, there's some headers you have to pass in for a get. For example, there's some APIs where you have to pass in, very similar to what I have here. You have to pass in like a bearer token. For example, if you're using Yelp API, you have to pass in like a bearer token, and you have to pass in whatever your token is, your API.
Okay, so when certain API calls require
different fields, different headers.
Okay.
So if it requires different headers, you have to go ahead and package that request with the header they're looking for.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Very good. Anybody else? Questions? All right. So here we are, URL session share data task, and most likely using either URL here or request. So we'll use request because that's what we're passing up with completion handler. So where it says with request, you pass in the request object you have. Completion has 3 arguments: data, which is optional, response, which is also optional, and error, which is also optional. So here you have 3 optional values, right? Before you use any of them, you need to verify that it's not nil. Is everybody able to build before I continue?
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Great, so here we are. We're inside the completion. We want to see if there's an error. So we'll say if let error equal to error. We're unwrapping the error. So if there is an error, if it's not nil, that means something went wrong here. If something went wrong, well, we need to also pass that for the completion handler. So let's go have a next case for this. So for here, we'll just call it network error. Go up to our enum. We'll come back to this code here. So let's go back to our enum case and put in network error. And we will capture what the error is. While we're here, we have a next error we could come across. What's the next error?
Decoding.
Decoding error. Very good. Okay. So let's continue on, and there could be more errors than this. Like there could be bad status code and all that stuff, but for now, we're just gonna keep those 3 and work with those 3 for now. Let's go continue on. So here we'll capture this network error. It's a failure. on our network, and we'll just pass in the error. Great. So here we are. So if we're down here, error is nil. If we get down to line 62, error is nil. So here we'll also go ahead and unwrap our data type. So data is also optional. Before you use it, you have to unwrap it. We're unwrapping it here. And now we have our data object in here. And we'll go ahead and decode. Actually, step 4, we'll just say decode the JSON to our Swift model. Okay, so here we are. We want to decode. We'll go ahead and wrap it in a do catch. Very similar to what we had before. In our test, we had results equal to try JSON decoder, code. We decoded the results wrapper and data. And again, we're using our completion to capture the value from the results. So completion, this is the only place we have success here. And it's looking for a station. Swift lets us know it needs a station array. So from the results constant here, we'll say results dot data dot stations, which is an array of stations. So at this point, the compiler is happy because this type matches with our result type. But we have one thing left. In that catch block, we could catch an X error here, and that error is our decoding error. Failure. Decoding error. So this is what we have here as far as like writing our code natively. And look at this, right? Even me, I almost forgot. What we never do is leave warnings in our code. So here, it's giving us a warning, right? We are not using data task. How should I use data task here? Cameron said it earlier. Somebody else? How can I use data task here? I'm missing a big part of this.
Resume it.
Resume it. So now we have data task and resume. Resume. Right. You forget this, you'll never get a call back from your network. So here we are, no warnings. We're leaving our code with no warnings. We have data task here. Because you could see code like this written where you don't have a constant and you attach the resume to the actual URL session like that. But I would caution against doing that because it's very easy to forget this. And your code doesn't give you any warnings. Everybody with me?
Yes.
So please practice writing this using a constant. That way you're not leaving your code with a warning and you'll know to resume. Other than that, if you do this, you'll most likely forget. But if you have a warning in your code, we know we don't leave warnings in our code. So we'll be able to capture that there. Very, very good. Okay, so this is where we are. Everybody's able to build?
Yep.
All right, cool. Let us continue on. We have our API client. We could write an, I'm sorry?
I have a question.
Yes.
Just to clarify, for the unit test, we have to import the project because it's a different target, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Yes, exactly. Very good. Very good answer. And yes.
Can I take a look at the top of the class?
The enum? We have
No,
3 cases.
The result.
Oh, the result. In here?
At the top. I'm not sure my computer is. Okay, yeah, thank you.
You got it?
Yeah, I got it. Thank you.
Okay, cool.
Did we use the request? Because I have a
Yes, definitely have to use it. Unless you use URL and you pass in the URL, but we use request here. This request was used here.
Yeah, I put it there, but I'm still, wait, variable.
Is it a variable? You change it to a let.
Yeah.
Because if it's a variable, you never mutated it. That's why you get a compiler error, or warning rather. Cool?
The result is not, it's not the top level. Result is what we want to get, right?
Oh, back in the JSON, you mean?
Like here, you put in the result, you put the array.
Yes, that's what we want to get. Yes, let me go back to that. Very good question. Here. So Luba's question was, in the result type, we put in whatever we want to get, not the top level.
Yeah, and then when we get when we do the decode over there, we always put the
Top level. Yeah, top level goes here. Very good questions here. Top level goes in the decode function. But as far as the result type, I could put in any sort of thing I expect to get back. I could even put in a string here, if that's what I'm after. Very good question. Cool, great. So now we have our fetch data. Let's go to our view controller and keep coding this out. We could write an asynchronous test for this, but for now, I will leave this and then just go to the view controller. And let's actually set up a table view to just show our data. Before that, actually, let's do, back in the view controller, let's actually rename this. Refactor, rename. Whenever you're submitting code, don't submit code where it just says view controller. Give it some sort of name that says what the thing is doing. In our case, we'll just call this stations view controller. And in our stations view controller, we will implement a function called fetch data. Again, I'm keeping all this generic just in case you guys want to go ahead and refactor the API client to be generic. Fetch data is just going to fetch our data, but we need an API client instance. API client equal to API client. And here I'll use my API client. And we have a fetch data with result. Pause here. So we have our API client instance because this is an instance function. And then in our instance function, we have our result type. This represents our result type. That one argument here is the result type that we have in our completion. Our completion captures whatever data is encapsulated into that result type. Result type has two values. Failure, two cases, failure or success. So this is the result type here. And then we'll use a switch statement to investigate which one of those is the case. So our result type will switch on result, case, failure. In our failure, we have an error, error. For now, we'll just print error here. And next case is our success case, which has our stations. And for our stations, we'll just dump the stations. Error. So this is enough for us to just test this and see if we get back data or an error. We'll call fetch data in our viewDid load. And when we're ready, we'll go ahead and run it. So one of those two things will happen. Either I have an error or I have all my stations. Looks like we have all our stations coming up here. I think we have a lot of stations actually. There's probably over 1,000 stations or something, who knows? Yes, 1,000 stations indeed. So you should be getting 1,039 elements or an error. But if our test passed earlier from our object, from our unit test, we should be good as far as the JSON parsing, because nothing here is optional. Is everybody able to get their elements dumped out?
Yeah.
All right, very good. Okay, so let's continue on to show our data in a table view. Easiest way to validate your data, show it in a table view. Let's go ahead and do so. Do we have a table view yet? No, we don't. Let's go to our storyboard and embed in our storyboard, embed our view controller in a navigation controller like we did yesterday, and grab a table view from the object library, and we'll set the constraints 0 all around. Next, we'll set up our cells, one prototype cell, and we'll make the cell type subtitled. We'll give this identifier name cell. Don't forget to put the identifier name. And next, we'll option click on our stations view controller. We'll control drag from our table view over to our view controller. We'll call it table view. We'll connect it. And this is all we need for now. And we will close our assistant editor, and we're now back in our view controller. So we have our table view. In our code here, let's just give our navigation item a title. We'll just call it city bike stations. Yesterday we did this in storyboard. Today we'll just do it programmatic. Again, review both ways. Run it and make sure your table view shows. There's not going to be data yet, but we should have our table view showing up. It's empty, and we should have our title showing city bike stations that we did here. And let's continue. So we have our table view. We'll use diffable table view sources as opposed to UI table view data source. So let's go ahead and set that up. We have an enum. We'll call this.
Alex?
Yes.
I have a question. After I changed the name of the
view controller,
even though I have the storyboard view controller connected or assigned to that view controller, it's not letting me create
close Xcode and reopen it.
Okay.
That might just be that, because sometimes that's what it is.
Okay.
And let me know how it's working out.
Okay.
So here we'll create an enum to represent our table view sections. And again, I'll give a to-do here. This is also in the lesson, but to do, use the region ID to create sections. Create multiple sections. The region ID we don't have yet, we could add it. And the enum for now will have one case, but you could have multiple cases. I'll just call it section for now. I'll just say primary. Yeah, that's fine. Primary is fine. Cool. So we have our section, and one thing before we get an error, actually that's fine. Let's get the error first and fix it. So let's continue defining our data source. It's actually going to be a subclass. Actually, no, it's not. That's your homework. UI table view diffable sources. Our section is section, and our item is station. And if we build, we'll get the regular, does not conform to protocol hashable. Mr. Oscar, sir, how can I fix this error?
Oh, you have to go to the model and change the conform to a hashable.
So go to the model and station, yes?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not sure which, I think you have to do for all, or.
In that case, only station we after, so only station. It doesn't cascade.
Okay.
So at that point, we'll just build. So there we go. So Oscar says we have to conform station to hashable because station is our item type. And with differable sources, both types needs to be hashable, which is great because we can't try to add in multiple or duplicates. It will give us warnings all over the place or even crash. Okay, so here we are, section, station, and let's continue on. Fetch data, let's do it right after fetch data. Right after fetch data, create a new function, configure data source. And our data source is currently nil, so we need to give it. Let me, for your homework, if you have the time, I'll actually start that out for you. So here we'll subclass UI table view diffable. And here I'll say class. For your homework, just remove this, but I'm just gonna keep this here. I'll call it data source UI. Its subclasses UI table view diffable data source. And the types are section. If you don't see section, you have to go ahead and type in station view controller dot section. And for the item is the same. The item is station. So this is our subclass. Okay. For now, it doesn't do anything, but for your homework or for your to-do, you need to do this in order to show to-do. Implement or continue to implement in order to show the section headers. Oh, good. So this gets you started. So for now, we'll actually just go ahead and use this data source here. Data source. This data source is coming from this data source, so we no longer have to type that whole thing out. Yesterday we saw type aliases, but the only reason why we're not doing type alias here is because we have more code to write in here if we do the extra items like title for header in section or any sort of like protocol methods. You have to implement them in here. So implement protocol, implement UI table view source methods. Any questions about that?
Ideally, would this be its own file?
Yes, 100%. Place in its own file. Yes, very good. Very, very good. Okay, so let's continue on. So here we have our table view, which is table view, and we have our cell provider, table view, index path, and station. Okay, let's configure our cell equal to table view dot dequeue reusable cell. Whatever your identifier name was in storyboard, you put it here. And you return cell. For our station, we'll use the name and the capacity for now. So we'll say cell.text label .text equal to station.name, and we'll say cell.detail text label .text equal to station.capacity, and we'll just prefix it with capacity, like capacity.
Sorry, I don't know whether I'm missing something. For the data source, can you go up to the top to your data source?
Here?
Yeah, I don't know why it's saying that.
This entire thing, by the way, we could change this to what? We just created a subclass.
Right, no, we could change to a constant like we did yesterday.
To data source, that was subclass data source.
But
what is the error you getting?
That is, it's saying it's an unresolved identifier.
Which one?
My data source.
Like the variable data source? What exactly? What?
Yeah, like I have my data source. Well, the variable that I have up top is UI diffable data source sections and station. That's what I had before.
And section, this section.
Yes.
And then the stations, right? Station.
Well, I don't have it as data source like that. I have it as the UI table view diffable data source.
You have this, right?
Yeah.
And you have section, which is this section.
Yeah.
And you have station.
Yes.
Build again.
That's okay. Let me just keep on.
No, but is the error still persisting? Like, share your screen. Because somebody else might be having the same error.
Okay.
Yeah, again, yesterday we did a type alias because we had no subclassing to do, but with the extra assignments I gave you, you'll definitely need to subclass the diffable data source to get the protocol functions.
It's raining hard.
Mister, who gave you a
It's raining hard.
Who gave you popsicle?
I gave myself.
You gave yourself, okay.
It's raining hard today.
What am I missing?
Let's see, data source, 1 second. It doesn't know about data source, does it? Do you have data source defined anywhere yet?
No, I just have this.
At the bottom, go at the bottom of the file, very bottom. That's the very bottom. Mm-hmm. On comment out 52 to 54. Oh, sorry, 53 to 54. Remove. Okay, build. There's one more error. Station controller, that's section. That should be section.
I just changed that, that's why.
Build. Okay, so that's good. Go all the way up. Because what's happening here is, go back, Tiffany, go down. So now you have a subclass called data source, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And then your file up top didn't know about data source because that was commented out.
But you don't have that.
I do.
Can I see yours?
1 second, after you clear yours up, go up to the very top. So now instead of also refactor line 22, it builds, but since you're using the same subclass, just like replace that with data source. Yep, build. And now you just need to do the cell configuration. So
okay,
stop sharing. I'll show you mine. Stop sharing.
You have this?
Yep, yep.
I didn't see that.
1 second, let me share mine. Because I left that for us as a to-do. So I set up the boilerplate code. Again, like Greg said, this is going to be its own file. And we're using this data source here.
Are you serious? We've done that before. That's okay.
That's okay.
All right.
But remember, put that in its own file when you keep working on this.
Yeah, yeah. But we did that before. We
did
it like that. Okay.
It's okay. So as Tiffany did here, also just make this data source here, which is our subclass. Is everybody able to compile? And Tiffany, this is what we have for the cell configuration.
Yes. The cell text that was a name, and then yeah. Perfect.
Station name. Good, good, good. All right, we have our configured data source. Let's continue on. Let's set up the initial snapshot for snapshot. Go to NS differable data sources, section, station. And apply it. I'll just apply it, and then we'll access whatever else we need to do. So apply, snapshot, animating differences, we'll say false. And we'll add a snapshot. We have no data yet. We'll just add the sections for now. Append sections. We have only one section. It's called primary. Cool. Are we good here? Are we good here? Yes? Confirmation, we good here? Can we continue?
Yeah. Quick question.
Yes, sir, go ahead.
We are not using the data source beneath the table view, right? Like on 920 or something. We're not using that one, right?
Which one? This one?
At the top. All the way up.
Sorry.
That one right there. 21.
21, this guy.
Yeah, we're not using that, right? We just like have.
No, we are. This is what we configured just now.
Okay.
This is what we configured here on 945.
Okay, no, I got it. My bad.
No, that's okay. Ask those questions. Any questions we have, shoot away. Okay, so we set up the initial snapshot. We have no data yet. And let's make sure.
Sorry. I just want to ask a question about data source since it kind of just came up. If we were to have multiple data sources for multiple types, we would just name them appropriately and they would each inherit the same kind of property. And we could set up what they would take in essentially from that custom class.
Exactly.
Okay, just want to make sure I understood that. Thank you.
Yep, you could have multiple ones there. Very good.
I'm getting an error adding these sections to the snapshot.
What's the error say? One, I think you're back on mute.
Against the syntax, there's a such like consecutive. I don't know.
Where are you? You trying to type in the snapshot here, or what line are you getting the error on?
Right after that line.
On snapshot append sections?
Yeah.
This expects an array. And then inside that array, you put in whatever section name you have. In our case, we're using an enum, so we say primary, dot primary. One?
Yeah, I guess, because I put it, oh, okay. It's still within, never mind, I see it now.
You got it? Okay, cool. It's raining cats and dogs now. Get your hot chocolate. Okay, so here we are. We set up the initial snapshot, and this is good. Let's call configure data source, and then fetch data is called as well. That's fine. This is gonna be calling fetch data. When we call fetch data, we'll be actually updating our snapshot here. So let's write a helper function for that. So private function update snapshot, like that. Update snapshot, we'll get the current snapshot. The beautiful thing about the data source snapshot again is you always get in the most recent, the most up-to-date snapshot from the data source. So here we are, we have the snapshot. And what do we want to do? Well, update snapshot needs the stations. So update snapshot, let's update our function to say update snapshot with stations. It expects an array of stations like that. And now I could say snapshot dot append items at some section. So in that case, we'll say it expects an array of stations. I have my stations called stations. And the section is simply primary. And lastly, we'll simply just say data source dot apply snapshot. Animating differences, true. So update snapshot will call, instead of calling dump stations here, we'll say dispatch queue.main.async and call self dot update snapshot stations and pass stations. And don't forget to break any retained cycles. Again, we're breaking any memory leaks here by using weak self. And here we have optional now, because this is weak self, is an optional. We call our update snapshot. We pass it the stations that we got here. It calls our update snapshot function. We get the current snapshot from the data source. We say snapshot, append the items we just got to our one section, which is primary. Go ahead, apply the changes. And that's it here for the snapshot.
Where we initially set up the
snapshot?
Yeah, I want to see something.
Let me close this so we all could all see.
For some reason, I'm getting an error saying reference, saying that it's inside of a closure. Return cell. Oh, I'm bugging out. Sorry.
Got it?
Yes.
I'm the rubber duck. I gotta start charging you for this.
I know. Sorry. I had my bracket and close parentheses behind one thing.
Nice. Good, good, good. All right, I think we have all the pieces in place. Let's just go over it before we run our code. So top level, where we at? We have our table view, we have our data source, we have our subclass. Well, data source here is a subclass. Subclass of UI table view source. We have our API client, which has our fetch function in there. We call vidded load. We set up our nav title bar. We call configure data source. We call fetch data. When we call fetch data, it's an asynchronous call. Here we break in the memory cycle by saying using a capture closure here. And here we have our first encounter of an error. Again, this should be an alert. And we have our success block. We have our stations captured by our closure. We use dispatch main because we have to update UI on the main thread. So we dispatch main async here. We call our update snapshot. This is the UI. This is UI code. That's why we did it on a dispatch main. And here we call the data source snapshot. We configured our cell here. By the way, you could also have your own custom cell very easily by typecasting it to whatever type you have. For example, like as custom cell, right? So same sort of code we did in our cell for row, you could do here. And that's what we have.
I
Go
would
ahead.
assume that, sorry, I would assume that the item that we're using, let's say we were doing configure cell on our cell file, it would work the same as it would as we've done in the past, right?
Exactly. Very good. Very, very good. Okay, let's give it a run and see what we have. Ah, look at that. We got all our stations. Does everybody have the stations populated?
Yeah.
What?
Yes.
Okay, so here we are. We have our cells. We see the byte capacity. Again, I really encourage us to take this app whichever way we want, as far as like something you could put on your GitHub to host on your GitHub. Like you could easily create a map view here where it shows how many bytes are left. The how many bytes are left is from the next endpoint that I put in the lesson link. But here it just shows you the capacity, like how many bytes can this particular rack hold. In that case, 55 for 52nd and 11th Avenue, and so on and so forth. So you could keep working through this app.
Getting an error.
What's your error?
It's saying that something's nil.
You mean
configure the data source?
In your update snapshot, can you scroll up for me, please? Okay, so var snapshot, it's saying right here where
did you do this in the success block?
In the success block, yes, I put self.update snapshot with stations.
Did you call configure data source in the view did load? Because I had that problem just now too.
Oh, I think I did not. Hold on.
All right. Thank you, Chelsea.
Thank you.
We gotta thank Chelsea here. Okay, so everybody got the table view populated? Any more errors? Are we good? Hello?
I'm trying to see.
But anybody else? Everybody's good?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Tiffany, keep us updated. Let's go back to the lesson and see what else we have here to do. We've done a lot with this JSON review lesson. So where to go from here, as I said before, you could very easily refactor the table view and use a map view. And then the data, the stations have a lat and a long. So you could use an annotation to show that on a map. The endpoint that shows you like real-time data for the bike stations is this endpoint here, station status. So it gives you real-time data of how many bikes are left and stuff like that. You could use that. You could allow the user to search because there's a lot of data here. It would be nice to like search the map view by zip code or whatever, or my current location, show me the closest city bike to me. Allow the user to search, did that. Refactor the API client here to use combine. There's a lot of like tutorials and stuff being written on combine. We will talk about combine after the break, but feel free to start looking at what combine looks like and refactor in your asynchronous closure to use combine. You could use persistence to favorite a station, and you could also create sections by using the region ID. There's only 2 regions, but you could use, just for your own practice, you could section out, because sectioning is a thing in itself. You could get a question like, hey, given this data, create sections from it. So that's a good thing to know how to do. So I'd highly recommend doing number